The summer heat shimmered off the metal hells of Panzer IVs lined up along a dusty road near Yelnya in August 1941. General Heinz Guderian climbed down from his command aft and walked along the calm, motionless tanks, his boots raising schmore clouds of Russian dust with each ship. The tank commanders stood in their turrets, watching him approach with expressions that met the spend, with barely concealed frustration. They knew what he was going to ask before he opened his mouth. How much fuel remained? The answer was always the same, always inadequate, always inadequate where they were, and where they need to be. Guderian had spent the previous night arguing with Field Marshal Fidel von Bock, commander of Army Gu Center, about the Alcatia fuel reserves for a renewed push toward Moscow. The argument had been civilized but pointed, with both men aware that they were fighting over resources that did not exist in sufficient quantity, no matter how they were defined. Von Bock wanted to concentrate fuel for an offensive toward the Soviet capital. Guderian believed his Panzer grew needed fuel to consolidate gains already made, to establish defensive positions before Soviet counterattacks materialized. Neither man was wrong. There simply was not enough fuel to do both. The fuel accounting the Guderian staff maintained had become a document of mounting aspiration. Each Panzer division reported its fuel status daily in precise percentages. And during 60% fuel capacity sounded adequate until one cohilted suitable met both world of carbohydrates or 2 days of limited movement. Below 40%, a division was effectively immobile for things approaches. By late August, most of Guderian's divisions hovered between 30 and 50%, occasionally spiking higher when a convoy ride lined up in quickly as a bridge assumed fresh mind. The fuel crisis forced Guderian to rethink fundamental assumptions about armed warfare that he had spent 2 decades developing. Its pre-war writings had emphasized continuous movement, the importance of paying a man to prevent enemy forces from stabilizing defensive lines. Russian distances had made that doctrine impossible to sustain. Even when fuel was available, the sheer kilometers involved meant that panzers could not maintain the relentless pace that had worked in France. Mechanical wear accumulated faster than maintenance could address it. Crews grew exhausted, and always, the fuel gauges dropped toward empty. German fuel gained primarily from 3 sources, each with its own limitations and vulnerabilities. Romanian oil fields, Plesti, produced the latest chat, but Romanian production was already committed to German industrial needs before the invasion began. Synthetic fuel plants in Germany converted coal into petroleum products, expensive and energy-intensive products that could not scale to meet military demands. Captured Soviet fuel stocks provided occasional windfalls, but Soviet demolition teams have proven efficient at destroying their own supplies during retreat. None of these sources could meet the demands of mechanized warfare at the scale Germany was attempting. The economic temptations behind Germany's fuel supply revealed strategic incoherence the entire Eastern campaign. In vain, Germany planners estimated that the Wehrmacht would need approximately 7 million tons of fuel annually to sustain operations of the Soviet Army. German and Romanian production combined produced approximately 6 million tons annually for all military and civilian purposes. The mathematics were impossible to start, but Ito and the High Command had convinced themselves that capturing Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus would solve the problem. The Caucasus oil fields lay more than 1,500 kilometers from the starting points of the German invasion, across some of the most difficult terrain in the Soviet Union. Even if German forces reached them quickly, converting captured facilities to German use would require months of engineering work. Meanwhile, Soviet scorched earth policies ensured that retreating forces would destroy or damage equipment, that would take years to replace. The plan to fuel German operations with Kencha Soviet oil was fantasy conception. Guderian had access to economic intelligence that made the fuel situation clear to anyone willing to examine it honestly. Germany consumed approximately 40,000 tons of fuel per day for all military operations worldwide. Eastern Front operations alone consumed approximately 25,000 tons daily during active operations. Romanian production delivered about 10,000 tons daily to the German military if the civilian and Romanian military needs were met. Synthetic fuel plants added another 5,000 tons daily. The shortfall was permanent and structural, not a temporary logistical leak-up. The fuel allocation decisions made at the highest levels of German command reflected political considerations as much as military necessity. The Kriegsmarine received priority allocations for its surface fleet and U-boat operations, despite the surface fleet being largely bottled up in port and contributing little to the war effort. The Luftwaffe received premium aviation fuel in quantities that exceed operational requirements in some theaters, while shortages paralyzed air operations in others. The Army received what the main, which was never enough for missions that were assigned. Guderian participated in fuel allocation conferences, where the discussion resembled negotiations between hostile powers, rather than coordination between branches of the military. Near representatives argued that submarine warfare would win the war by strangling with high lines. Air Force representatives insisted that strategic bombing would break Soviet industrial capacity. Army representatives pointed out that neither submarines nor bombers would win the war if the Soviets overran German ground positions. Each Soviet defended its allocation while attacking others, and the shortages ensured no one received enough to accomplish their missions fully. The synthetic fuel program represented German industrial ingenuity applied to an impossible task. The Fischer-Tropsch process could indeed convert coal into liquid fuel, and German engineers had built sophisticated plants that function efficiently. But the economics were terrible. Producing 1 ton of synthetic fuel required approximately 4 tons of coal and enormous amounts of electricity. The coal and electricity consumed in fuel production were not available for steel production, weapons manufacturing, or civilian heating. Every liter of synthetic fuel came at the cost of some other critical resource. Sabotage and bombing of synthetic fuel plants create cascading effects throughout the German war economy. A single successful bombing raid had destroyed plant production capacity for a month, and the Rand forces would receive reduced allocations, that air operations would be curtailed, that training would be reduced. The vulnerability of concentrated industrial facilities to air attack made synthetic fuel production an increasingly unreliable source as the war progressed and Allied bombing intensified. Romanian politics complicated the fuel supply even further. Romania was an ally, not a conquered territory, which meant that Germany could not simply commandeer all Romanian oil production. Romanian domestic needs had to be met. Romanian military forces required fuel for their own operations, and Romanians demanded payment or trade goods for fuel exported to Germany. The negotiation of fuel deliveries became a constant diplomatic dance where military urgency confronted political reality. The distance from fuel source to combat zone created a logistical puzzle that no amount of organizational brilliance could solve. Fuel produced in Romania had to travel by ship up the Danube River or by rail through the Balkans to reach Germany. From Germany, it traveled by rail to Poland, and converted so that rail lines running on different gauges. At the railhead, transferred trucks through the final leg to forward supply dumps. Each transfer point introduced delay. Each kilometer traveled consumed fuel for Jammerveld. Each gained the pipeline at the day the Panzers waited. Guderian established a system of priority allocation that created resentment, but was necessary for maintaining any combat capability at all. Division commanders with the requests for fuel based on side missions. Staff evaluated the requests, comparing mission importance as fuel availability, and allocated the limited supplies accordingly. Guderians tasked with events and operations received priority. Those in defensive sectors received minimal allocations. The system was rational but cruel, creating a hierarchy where some units operate while others sat idle. The priority system created perverse incentives. Division commanders learned to exaggerate their fuel needs, padding requests in ambitious cuts. They hoarded fuel when they received and were looking to spend precious supplies on anything but the most essential missions. They developed informal trading networks, bartering fuel for ammunition or food or spare parts where other divisions. The black market fuel that developed within Guderian's command was technically illegal but tacitly acknowledged as inevitable. Soviet partisans identified German fuel convoys as priority tasks. A successful ambush of a fuel truck column accomplished more than destroying enemy vehicles. It denied the Germans mobility for days or weeks. Partisan intelligence that struck convoy moons, identifying patterns of vulnerable place. Attacks escalated for the summer and autumn 1941, forcing the Germans to allocate command troops to convoy escorts, which further reduced available forces for frontline operations. The escorts themselves consumed fuel, creating another paradox in the resource allocation puzzle. A convoy that required a platoon of armored cars or protection burned fuel to transport fuel. The larger the escort force, the more fuel was consumed in the transport forces themselves. Various logistics officers calculating optimal escort sizes that balance security against efficiency, but optimal on paper rarely matched reality on ambushed roads. Weather became a direct factor in fuel consumption in ways the peacetime playing necessitated. Summer dust-clogged air filter, requiring engines to work harder and consume more fuel. Or in rain-trodden roads to mud, aboard tripled fuel such as vehicles strode the muck. Wind cold and the engine had to idle for hours to prevent freezing burning fuel without accomplishing any movement. Each season brought its own fuel crisis. The fuel shortage influenced tactical decisions in ways that were visible to outside
observers, but obvious to Guderian. He could not afford to conduct reconnaissance in strength because reconnaissance consumed fuel. He could not maneuver to flank enemy positions because flanking movements required longer marches than direct assaults. He could not pursue retreating Soviet forces aggressively because pursuit meant potentially running out of fuel deep in enemy territory. Each tactical choice was constrained by fuel availability. German tanks themselves were not designed for fuel efficiency. The Panzer III and Panzer IV that formed the backbone of Guderian's forces were mechanically reliable but thirsty. A Panzer IV consumed approximately 200 litres per 100 kilometres on roads, more in cross-country movement. With fuel tanks holding approximately 470 litres, a Panzer IV had a theoretical range of about 200 kilometres on roads, much less in combat conditions. The Soviet T-34, by comparison, had significantly better fuel economy, giving Soviet forces greater operational range. The technical specifications of German tanks reflected design priorities that had not anticipated the Russian campaign's demands. German tank designers had optimized for mechanical reliability, crew comfort, and combat effectiveness within European distances. The Maybach engines that powered most German tanks were precisely engineered, powerful, and remarkably reliable by 1941 standards. But they were not fuel efficient, and their designers had never imagined they would need to operate 1,000 kilometers from their supply bases. Fuel consumption varied dramatically based on terrain and combat conditions, in ways that theoretical specifications never captured. A Panzer IV, moving on a paved road at steady speed, achieved fuel economy close to its rated consumption. The same tank, moving cross-country through marsh or forest, consumed 3 times as much fuel. In combat, with constant acceleration, deceleration, and high-power maneuvers, consumption could increase 5-fold. Guderian's operations officers learned to calculate fuel requirements based on worst-case scenarios, but even those pessimistic estimates often proved inadequate. The auxiliary fuel drums that could be attached to tank hulls provided additional range but created their own problems. The drums were vulnerable to small arms fire and shrapnel, making them dangerous to carry in combat zones. They had to be emptied and discarded before engaging the enemy, which meant planning refueling points before battles. The drums themselves were heavy and awkward, requiring manual handling by crews who were already exhausted. Many divisions ran out of drums before they ran out of tanks, limiting their ability to extend operational range even when fuel was available. German engineers experimented with various technical solutions to the fuel crisis, most of which proved impractical. Some proposed installing larger fuel tanks on existing tank models, but this required extensive redesign and reduced internal space for ammunition or crew. Others suggested developing more fuel-efficient engines, but new engine designs would take years to develop and test. A few advocated for diesel engines like those in Soviet tanks, but Germany lacked petroleum resources for diesel fuel and would have needed to convert the entire industrial infrastructure. The fuel crisis drove innovation in recovery and maintenance procedures. German mechanics developed techniques for extracting usable fuel from tanks
that had been damaged or destroyed. They on to drain fuel systems compete for performing repairs, saving every droop. They created improvised filters to clean contaminated fuel for reuse. They began expert at diagnosing fuel filter proppings quickly and repairing it with minimal results. These skills meant German tank engines were the best in the world. But technical excellence could not create fuel that did not exist. Radio communication consumed fuel indirectly by requiring generators and charging systems that ran on petroleum. Guderian's command network relied on radio patrouilling across his widely dispersed forces. As fuel shortages intensified, some units had to choose between running radios and moving vehicles. The communication breakdowns that resulted from prioritizing movement over communication created coordination problems that multiplied the inefficiency operations. Units moving without radio contact made outdated tactical decisions, duplicated efforts, or worked at cross purposes. The half-tracks that followed as infantry transports and reconnaissance vehicles and panzer maneuvers consumed fuel had rates comparable to tanks, but received lower priority in allocation decisions. Infantry commanders argued that their vehicles were essential to combined arms operations. The panzers without infantry support were vulnerable. That mobility for all elements was necessary to blitzkrieg tactics to function. Their ions were prioritized, but could not change the basic scarcity. Half-tracks encasing the operation and reduced precision, or were left behind, while infantry marched on foot. Guderian observed that fuel shortage created a vicious cycle in maintenance operations. Tanks needed regular operations to identify mechanical problems before they became serious. But regular operation consumed fuel that was needed for combat. The result was that mechanical portents went undetected until they caused failures during operations. Failures during operations left tanks stranded and requiring recovery, which consumed more fuel. A cycle of inadequate maintenance leading to increased failures leading to increased fuel consumption had no good solution when the constraints of available resources. The hurricanes and oils required for tank operation were petroleum products subject to the same supply-constrained fuel. As shortages intensify, maintenance schedules had to be extended, with oil tenders and lubrication happening as frequently the women. The reduced maintenance accelerated wear on engines and transmissions, shortening vehicle lifespan and increasing the rate at which tanks required major overhauls or became casualties. The fuel crisis tended to the vehicle did, and tents that never encountered enemy fire. The fuel crisis created strange situations where German forces achieved tactical victories that could not be exploited. A successful attack might penetrate Soviet line and create an opportunity for deep exploitation. Vodka fuel prevented the fire. Soviet forces learned the German breakthroughs had limited depth because fuel constraints would halt they advance within a day or two. They adapted their defensive tactics accordingly, trading forward positions for time, knowing they could counterattack once German momentum stalled. The doctrine of exploitation that Guderian had pioneered in France became impossible to execute in Russia under fuel constraints. The theory held that once a breakthrough was achieved, armed forces should race through the gap, driving deep into enemy real areas to create chaos, cut supply lines, and force mass surrenders. This requires sustained high-speed movement for days or even weeks, precisely what fuel shortages may impose on. Breakthroughs occurred but could not be exploited, turning potential strategic victory into mere tactical successes. Guderian developed a painful expertise in explaining to higher headquarters why operations that looked feasible on maps were impossible in reality. Staff officers in Constable headquarters, hundreds of kilometers behind the front, had maps showing German positions just kilometers from objectives. He could not understand why Guderian did not simply order his Panzers IV to seize these objectives. He explained repeatedly that the kilometers shown on the map each required fuel to traverse. That fuel which existed on supply requisitions did not necessarily exist in his fuel trucks. That promising an operation was different from being able to execute it. The planning process for operations became dominated by fuel calculations to an extent that would have seemed absurd before the campaign. Before committing to an offensive, Guderian's staff had to calculate not just whether they had enough fuel to reach the objective, but whether they would have enough to consolidate the position afterward, to respond to counterattacks, to withdraw if necessary. The fuel requirement for an operation often exceeded the fuel requirement for the initial advance by a factor of 3 or 4. Many operations that appeared feasible based on distance to objective proved impossible, and total fuel requirements were calculated. Soviet deception operations exploited German fuel constraints brilliantly. Soviet commanders learned to create the appearance of weakness in their lines, knowing the few starved German forces would concentrate limited resources to attack the perceived weakness. The weak point would prove to be a Jap, heavily defended and prepared. German forces would expend their limited fuel attacking precision Brulampy Tigran, leaving them immobilized and vulnerable when Soviet counterattacks came against other sectors. The timing of operations became as much about fuel delivery schedules as about tactical opportunity. Guderian would identify objective need attacking quickly if all Soviet forces get reimbursed, and Sov would counter-raid to fuel reconnoitered and requested from any route logistics. Fuel might arrive in 3 days or in 3 weeks, depending on transport availability and priorities assigned by higher headquarters. By the time fuel arrived at headquarters duty thus vanished, the Soviets having reinforced the position or abandoned for better ride. Fuel delays turned timely operations into obsolete ones. Human intelligence by Soviet fuel lies provided more comfort. Reports indicated that Soviet forces also struggled with fuel shortages, particularly in mechanized units. Soviet forces operated on shorter supply lines, used rail transport more extensively, and benefited from Lend-Lease fuel delivery from the United States through Pripyat and Murmansk. Or reportedly, Soviet operational doctrine relied less on mobile warfare and more on artillery and infantry, which consumed their fuel than German mechanized operations. Soviet fuel shortages constrained their operation did not paralyze the way German shortages did. The allocation of captured Soviet fuel created ethical and practical dilemmas. Some captured fuel was clearly military stock, marked as such and stored in military facilities. It could be used without qualm. Other fuel came from civilian sources, seized from collective funds, industrial facilities, or civilian vehicles. Using this fuel meant depriving Soviet civilians of the means to harvest crops, eat homes, or operate essential services. Guderian issued homers omitting the use of all captured fuel got this origin. Some measures bought what their source fed from civilians. The ethical debate was resolved by necessity and left resigning and go. The intelligence value of fuel right extended beyond German forces. Soviet intelligence services clocked German fuel consumption patterns to assess German operational capabilities and predict German tensions. A German sector showing increased fuel areas with likely preparing offensive. A center where fuel diverse George was probably Germany's defense or was being deprioritized. Soviet commanders used fuel intelligence to allocate their own limited resources, concentrating forces against sectors where German fuel constraints made them vulnerable. Guderian's staff developed elaborate systems for tracking fuel consumption and predicting supply needs. They maintained logs showing fuel burn per kilometer advance, per hour of combat, per day of static defense. They created models predicting consumption under different scenarios. They cross-referenced weather forecasts with consumption patterns, knowing that moderate snow increased fuel usage. The sophistication of their logistics intelligence was impressive. They had only served to make clear how inadequate the fuel supplies were for in-gun operation. Guderian experimented with creating fuel caches in fortifications, pre-positioned supplies of food operations. The caches were dug in and camouflaged, marked on maps for later use. Later advances sometimes overran the cache positions before utilized. Other caches were discovered by partisans and destroyed. The pre-positioning strategy worked occasionally, but proved unreliable as a systematic solution. Luftwaffe competed with the army for fewer supplies, creating inter-service tensions that rose to the highest levels of German command. Air operations required high-grade aviation fuel. It could not be substituted with regular gasoline. Ground vehicles could, in theory, use low grades of fuel, though with reduced performance. The Luftwaffe argued that air superiority was essential for ground operations to succeed. The Panzer commanders argued that without ground advances, air superiority accomplished nothing. Both were correct. Neither could be fully satisfying with available supplies. Transport aircraft fared to the fuel directly to Fort Hughes, bypassing the vulnerable ground supply routes. Guderian acquired air supply routes multiple times, and Kriegsmarine received. But the amount of fuel that could be delivered by air was trivial compared to what his panzers consumed. A Junkers Ju-52 transport could carry perhaps 2,000 liters of fuel, enough for 10 tanks to operate for a few hours. Dozens of aircraft would be needed to meaningfully supply a Panzer division, and the Luftwaffe had neither the aircraft nor the aviation fuel to sustain such operations. The fuel shortage affected German intelligence gathering in unexpected ways. Aerial reconnaissance consumed aviation fuel. Radio intercept units required generators that burned fuel. Motorized reconnaissance patrols used fuel. As supplies tightened, all these intelligence gathering activities were reduced or curtailed. Guderian found himself making operational decisions with less information than in PS earlier in the campaign, flying more blind as resources became scarce. German soldiers became expert fuel thieves, the Guderian Fischlich Wagnite practice. They signed fuel abandoned Soviet vehicle for dying German vehicles being cannibalized bind from sublindums reportedly gained. Trees, cigarettes, and chocolate to supply personnel for extra fuel occasions. They fossify sous consumption pores to retain surplus fuel for emergencies. The unofficial fuel economy that operated alongside the official supply system was essential to maintaining even the limited mobility that German forces possessed. The maintenance and implications of fuel shortages were severe and often overlooked strategic assessments. Tanks needed to run regularly to maintain mechanical health, to keep batteries charged, to prevent seals from drying and leaking. But running tanks in tandem consumed fuel near operations. Guderian's maintenance ISIS faced impossible traces between mechanical preservation and fuel conservation. May tanks died problems from seeing idle that were not crying and railing and bracing. Fuel quality varied wildly, making its nightmares. Fuel from Romanian refiners met German specifications. Synthetic fuel from German plants was adequate. Captured solar fuel ranged from excellent to terrible, with no way to predict quality. Without chemical testing that was rarely available in fuel geysers. Mixing different fuel types sometimes created /clod fuel fissions. Contaminated fuel damaged fuel pumps and carburetors. And Koenig spent as much time dealing with fuel-related problems as with car damage. A psychological dimension of fuel shortage extended beyond individual soldiers' morale to affect command allegiance. Guderian's subordinate division commanders grew frustrated with a precise, arbitrary fuel allocations. From their perspective, their sector was the critical one, their mission the most important, their need for fuel the most urgent. Guderian had to balance military necessity and the parties of command, ensuring able commanders had not become so alienated that they're most efficient. The fuel crisis enhanced German assessments of Soviet and most important. In and Tartar studied captured document and interrogated prisoners to understand Soviet fuel production and distribution. Then distributed Soviet fuel supplies when also constrained, though less severely than German supplies. A different way, had Soviet forces operate interior lines with shorter supply route, while drone forces operated at increasing distance to their supply bases. Both sides struggled with fuel, but geography favored disabuse. Guderian observed how fuel shortage changed the character of combat. Early in the campaign, German tactics emphasized speed, surprise, and maneuver. By late 1941, German operations became more methodical and grinding, resembling First World War battles more than the revolutionary blitzkrieg that had shocked the world in 1940. The change was partly due to Soviet adaptation and resistance, but fuel shortage was a major factor in slowing German operations to a crawl. The relationship between fuel availability and casualty rates was direct and measurable. Units with adequate fuel could maneuver, could avoid unfavorable engagements, could withdraw when necessary, could respond to threats flexibly. Fuel-starved units fought from static positions because they could not maneuver. Static positions suffered higher casualties from Soviet artillery and infantry attacks. Guderian tracked the correlation as at reports, noting that immobile divisions suffered 30 to 40% higher casualties than mobile ones. German propaganda, both to troops and to the home front, never mentioned fuel shortages. Official communications emphasized German victories, Soviet losses, and the inevitability of final triumph. Soldiers who wrote home about fuel problems found their lectures censored. The gap between official narrative and ground reality grew to cynicism among combat troops who knew that the situation was far grimmer than propaganda admitted. Guderian's relationship with Hitler deteriorated partly over fuel issues. Fewer demanded continued advances, insisted on ambitious objectives, and dismissed logistical constraints as defeatism. Guderian tried to explain that panzers without fuel were useless metal, that operational tempo was limited by supply capacity, that further advances would only extend supply lines without achieving decisive results. It's the what excuses rather than analysis, witness rather than professional assessment. The fuel crisis in autumn 1941 created strategic obstacles that they skillfully exploited. Soviet commanders noted which German sectors remained static for days or weeks, correctly inferring that these sectors were fuel-starved. They concentrated their limited offensive capabilities against these immobile sectors, achieving tactical successors who would have been puzzle against free-food German forces. The fuel shortage was not just a journey for win, it was a soy or duty. Guderian developed contingency plans for conducting defensive operations with minimal fuel, recognizing that the offensive phase of the campaign was ending where the German command had notched if or not. Defensive warfare consumed less fuel offensive operations, but still required mobility to respond to threats, to shift reverse, to counterattack enemy penetrations. He calculated minimum fuel reserves needed to maintain defensive flexibility and fought to ensure his units retained at least that minimal capability. The winter of 1941-42 brought the fuel crisis to its peak. Cold weather increased consumption, while Soviet offensives demanded mobility that fuel shortages made impossible. German units that should have conducted mobile defense instead fought static battles because they lacked fuel or knew. Positions became untenable, could not be evacuated. Counterattacks demanded hostile situations, could not be waged. The fuel shortage turned what might have been flexible defensive operations into desperate lost stands. Guderian was relieved of command in December 1941, officially for conducting an unauthorized retreat. But the underlying tensions about retreats and realistic assessments contributed to his dismissal. His replacement inherited the same few problems, with even fewer supplant of an. The crisis that Guderian had identified attempting to address through tactical adaptation and honest reporting continued to worsen after his departure. The lessons Guderian learned about fuel and logistics influenced his thinking for the remainder of his military career. When done to act as source in 1943's Inspector General of Panzer troops, he emphasized the logistical sustainability in operation. He advocated for smaller, phase-apart operations over larger, fuel-starved ones. He pushed for improved fuel efficiency and tank design. And then he forgot the autumn 1941, when his Panzer sat immobile in Russian fields, while pursued his best for lack of fuel. The fuel shortage of the Eastern Front in 1941 represented more than a logistical failure. It revealed the fundamental mismatch between German strategic ambitions and German resource scarcity. Germany had chosen to fight a continental war against an opponent with vast space and resources, while lacking the petroleum supplies necessary to sustain mechanized operations at that scale. Tactical skill and operational excellence could not overcome this basic strategic impossibility. Years later, military historians would analyze the German fuel crisis as a case study in the relationship between logistics and strategy. They would note that German planning for Operation Barbarossa had been criminally optimistic about supply requirements, that assumptions about capturing Soviet fuel stocks proved false. At the campaign scope exceeded German logistical capacity in the beginning. Guderian, reading these analyses, would nod in recognition, remembering the dusty roads and motionless planks of that terrible summer in Arden. The fields of Russia, where Guderian's panzers sat immobile in 1941, returned to agricultural use after the war, the tank tracks and fuel stains eventually disappearing beneath new growth. But the military lessons remained, studied by armies that sought to understand the relationship between fuel, mobility, and military power. Guderian's experience demonstrated that in modern war, fuel was not just a supply item, but a weapon in itself, and that running out of fuel could defeat an army as surely as running out of soldiers or ammunition. The general who had revolutionized armored warfare learned in Russia at revolution acquired resources, that brain tactics meant nothing without the fuels outside them, and that distance and logistics ultimately set boundaries that courage and skill could not cross. The panzer that cannot move is not a panzer, but a taunt. A general without fuel is not a commander, but an observer. These were lessons written in Russian dust at German frustration, lessons that shaped military thinking for generations to come.